Hello and welcome to another episode of the N1 Fitness Podcast. Today I'm super pumped on our guest. We've got Stephan Guyenet. Stephan's a writer, international speaker, and science consultant with a PhD in neuroscience from the University of Washington. His publications have been cited over 1,800 times, and he recently wrote and released his book, The Hungry Brain, Outsmarting the Instincts That Make Us Overeat. How you doing, Stephan?
I'm good. Thanks, Marcus. And congratulations for pronouncing my name correctly.
Oh, I nailed it. Good. Awesome, man. I've listened to you on so many podcasts. I've heard a bunch of different pronunciations, but I'm glad I got it right. All right, man. Well, starting it off, can you just give us a little bit more insight on how you started with studying the regulation of body fat when it comes to the brain and what initially attracted you to the subject?
Yeah, so I've always been interested in science and neuroscience in particular. When I was a kid, I used to read science textbooks for fun. I ended up in a PhD program at the University of Washington studying neuroscience. And I've always been interested in health and fitness as well, always been physically active, always thought a lot about diet. And I ended up in this neuroscience program studying neurodegenerative disease. It was pretty interesting work. We were working with mouse models of a neurodegenerative disease called SCA7. And while the work was interesting, we were studying a fairly rare, or actually a very rare disorder. And I started to think that maybe I should start to look for ways to have a larger impact and also to bring my professional interests in line with my personal interests of health and nutrition. And so I started to look around, and around that time I became interested, or I should say I became aware of and interested in the role of the brain in eating behavior and body fat regulation. And I guess my initial insight was that the brain is involved in body fat regulation. I think that's something I didn't know at the time, and I think that's still something a lot of people in the general public don't understand. And so for my postdoc, I was offered a position with Mike Schwartz at the University of Washington studying the brain regulation of body fatness. And I accepted that offer, and Mike is a really high-quality researcher in this area who's done a lot of important work on brain regulation of body fatness and blood glucose, so I was really happy to be able to work with him. And it quickly became obvious to me that we were studying the right organ. Because not only does the brain regulate body fatness, it regulates all behaviors. I should say it generates all behaviors, all feelings, all impulses. All of that comes from the brain. So any eating behavior you engage in, any feeling of hunger you have, any craving that you have, all of that's coming from the brain. And so it makes a lot of sense to take a brain-centric perspective when you're trying to think about eating behavior and body weight. But I think, and I think that's kind of obvious, as obvious as it is, though, I think it's not a perspective that a lot of people are taking right now. It's not really something that that most people carry around with them in their mental model of how eating behavior and body fatness work. And so, it's only recently that we've really developed the level of evidence that we need to start really understanding how that works, how those brain circuits work. Because even though it's obvious that the brain is centrally involved in all of these things that we care about, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's useful to take a brain-centric perspective. That really depends on the level of knowledge that we have, and we're just now getting there. To the point where it's really useful to look at it from that perspective. And so that, coupled with the fact that most of that evidence is not really making it to a general audience at this point, it's really still in the pages of academic journals primarily, that stimulated me to write my book, The Hungry Brain, to bring these insights that I think are really extremely profound coming out of the scientific literature, to bring those to a more general audience.
I totally agree, man, and I'm so glad you came out of sort of that heavily research-based to write a book that's going to just reach more people, and it sounds like that's what you really wanted to do as far as putting things that you put in your life to implement on a practical basis and then share those with other people so they could implement the same thing. That's amazing. So I like to start at the beginning. As far as the economics of eating, can you tell us a little bit more about optimal foraging strategy?
Yeah, absolutely. So the ability to efficiently acquire food is obviously a primary driver of natural selection. And so animals have been selected on the basis of being able to efficiently acquire food. So an animal that is good at it is going to have better reproductive success than an animal that's not good at it. And reproductive success is the currency of natural selection. So we've been crafted over the course of evolution, us and all other animals, to generate efficient food-seeking behaviors. And those efficient food-seeking behaviors tend to revolve around energy. So energy appears to be the primary motivator for omnivorous animals such as humans that can acquire a variety of different types of foods and can eat a variety of different types of foods. So by energy, I'm talking about calories or kilojoules or however you prefer to think about it. And so as it turns out, there are obviously more and less effective ways to acquire energy from your environment. And there are certain rules that govern, there are certain principles that govern how it's most efficient to acquire energy. And these are very simple economic principles of the type that are familiar to anyone who has thought about making financial investments or anything like that.
Right.
It's basically just the calorie return rate. So it's the value of a food item, and therefore whether it should be selected over other foods and how much effort you should expend in seeking it is equal to the number of calories that food contains minus the number of calories it takes you to acquire and process it divided by time. So it's just the calorie return rate. It's a very simple economic equation that you can apply to many different areas of life, and one of those is foraging in a natural environment. And it turns out that it's not just animals that do this. This formula was developed in non-human species, but it turns out to also apply to human hunter-gatherers. So you can predict to a surprisingly accurate degree. It's not perfect prediction, of course, but to a surprisingly large degree, you can predict what foods human hunter-gatherers will pursue based on this calorie return rate equation. And so essentially what this equation describes, if we decompose it into two key principles, it describes the costs and the benefits of food. And so you have the costs are the energy cost of acquiring and processing the food and the time cost. And in modern times, that's reflected also by the money cost of food, which money is it's a
reflection indirect. Of time.
Yeah, it's a reflection of time and effort, basically, that you put into earning that money. So when you buy something, the amount of money you have to spend on it is essentially proportional to the amount of time and effort you expended to acquire that money. So basically, those are the costs, and then the benefit is the number of calories in the food. And this is something that your brain assesses on a non-conscious level and uses that to kind of motivate you for the food. And as it turns out, in hunter-gatherer situations, when the benefits of food are very high, in other words, when there's a very concentrated source of calories that's readily available, when the costs are really low, when it has a low energy and time cost, they will stuff themselves on these foods. So this describes a food. Basically, we would say, in colloquial terms, we would say this food's a really good deal. It's a really great food, and it doesn't cost very much in time, effort, or money. And so we would say that's a really great deal. And the brain loves good deals, whether it's food, whether it's a job, whether it's you're cruising for the best prices on Amazon. The brain loves a good deal. The most benefit for the least cost. And so when a hunter-gatherer is in this situation, they will eat incredible amounts of food. I mean, they will chug like a liter of honey. These are things that anthropologists described to me who I interviewed. They'll drink a liter of honey in one sitting, 5 pounds of fatty meat, 20 to 30 wild oranges that are apparently similar to the ones we have in our grocery store in terms of size and sweetness. So they'll eat just absurd amounts of food. And I think essentially our brains today are still wired in a similar way. I mean, we may not respond to food and to our food environment in exactly the same way as a hunter-gatherer. I think the context is different, but I think our brains are still wired to intuitively respond the same to economic incentives. And so when we see food that's a really great deal, like free pizza, for example, everybody knows how fast free pizza, free cookies disappear. Those types of things very powerfully drive eating behavior. It's as simple as that. And so I think in today's world, where we have so many good deals that we're surrounded by, where the time, effort, and monetary cost of food are very, very low by historical standards. I mean, people like to complain about the cost of food. In the 1930s, food costs practically 3 times what it does now as a percentage of disposable income.
Wow.
So food has never been cheaper in human history than it is right now in terms of money, effort, and time cost of acquiring it. So, and it's very calorie dense. Of course, we're surrounded by a wide variety of very tempting, very calorie dense foods. So that makes for an extremely good deal that essentially is provoking the same impulsive circuits in our brains that coming across 30 wild oranges or 5 pounds of fatty meat would provoke in a hunter-gatherer. And I think it's just one of the things that nudges us to overeat. And then we know this is something I go into in greater detail in my book, and I'll just mention this briefly right now. But I mean, we know some of the brain circuits that are regulating this. We know that the orbitofrontal cortex, for example, collects information about all the costs and benefits about a particular action, such as eating a brownie or eating an apple or brownie versus apple. And it essentially collects all the pros and cons and comes to a decision about which option is the best, eating the brownie, eating the apple, or eating nothing. And that drives behavior selection by the brain and ultimately behavior and the consumption of those foods, consumption or non-consumption.
Yeah, and that's something actually that I want to get into a little bit with Dan, as far as Dan Party, that is, as far as being in a sleep-restricted state and how those pros and cons can be basically swayed in one direction or another as far as food decisions go. It's fascinating. But so basically we have this internal wiring to get as much food as possible in the quickest amount of time as possible while expending the least amount of energy. So basically drive-thrus and food delivery systems are jackpot on that front. What are the various properties in food that we're looking for as far as protein, starch, sugar, and those various properties that you mentioned in your book that are highly rewarding to the brain?
Yeah, so going back briefly to the optimal foraging theory equation I talked about with calorie return rate, it turns out that calories, calorie is kind of an abstract concept that we use to label the energy value of a food to the body. But really what we're talking about is the potential energy in chemical bonds that are contained in specific types of chemicals, like carbohydrates, fat, and protein. So those are the primary energy delivering types of molecules. And so when you talk about the brain seeking calories, it actually doesn't directly seek calories. What it's actually looking for is specific chemicals that contain chemical energy that your body can use. And so your body and brain are specifically wired to look for these chemicals in food and to motivate you according to their concentration in food. And the high level output of this is that you end up being a calorie seeking animal. But the more granular version is that you have specific receptors in your small intestine, all along much of your digestive tract, but especially in your upper small intestine, that detect sugar, starch. Really, they're detecting glucose mostly as a proxy for carbohydrate content, amino acids that represent protein, and then fatty acids that represents fat. So your gut is measuring the amount of protein, carbohydrate, and fat that you eat, as well as some other things like salt intake, and then the concentration of bitter compounds and other things that are aversive. And all that stuff goes back up to the brain. And the brain is essentially saying, the brain, when all that stuff goes back up to the brain is measuring the amount of those substances in the food you just ate and deciding how much it likes that food. So your brain is wired to have a positive response to things that are concentrated in protein, carbohydrate, fat, and salt. And when it detects those things, it begins to release a compound that many of you probably heard of called dopamine. And dopamine essentially is a chemical that that causes you that reinforces your behavior. So whatever you're doing, when the dopamine hits, you're going to want to do more of it. And then the next time you encounter cues that predict that same thing, you're going to also want to do it. So if you eat a pizza, your brain's going to get wind through these receptors that there's lots of fat, lots of starch, some protein, and that it's all very concentrated. Your brain's going to get wind of that, and your dopamine's going to start spiking. And then what happens, your brain remembers all the sensory cues that are associated with that food. So it remembers the appearance of the box, the appearance of the slices, the round pepperonis, the smell of the tomatoes and cheese and bread. It remembers the taste of it, the texture, where you were when you ate it, who you were with, the logo of the restaurant where you ate it. All that stuff gets filed away in your brain and marked. It gets flagged as significant. It gets flagged as a significant predictor of this awesome outcome, which is a huge truckload of starch and fat and protein delivered right to your gut. And so the next time you encounter those sensory cues, the appearance, the smell, the texture, etc., that gets your dopamine spiking again, because your brain has learned you don't even have to eat it anymore. You don't even have to get the food down to those receptors anymore. The cues themselves get your dopamine spiking and trigger your craving. In other words, your food-specific motivation to eat that food. And so this is the same way drug reinforcement works. It's the same thing. If you're trying to quit smoking and you see a friend of yours who you often smoke with, you're probably going to want a cigarette. If you go into a smoky bar, you're going to want a cigarette. Those are cues that remind your brain of the availability of a cigarette. Same way with food. If you encounter the smell of pizza, the sight of pizza, those are cues that remind your brain of the availability of pizza and trigger a motivational state that drives you toward that behavior. It's simply dopamine-mediated reinforcement. So basically that's how it works when we get more granular on the calorie part of that optimal foraging equation and what the brain is really looking for. So those are the specific things the brain's really looking for, and we have specific receptors for them. We have specific parts of the brain that measure them and use those to set your food-specific motivation and teach you, by virtue of experience, what foods contain concentrated amounts of those nutrients. And so the more concentrated the nutrients, the more of a dopamine response you get, and the stronger that reinforces your behavior to seek those things, the stronger of a craving and motivational response you'll get. And so this is why we crave pizza or brownies or chocolate and not plain cucumbers and plain lentils and plain celery and things with a very low calorie density. This is why some of us can develop even addictive like behaviors or eating behaviors that are hard to control around certain types of food, like brownies or pizza or chocolate, or things that have these highly, highly motivating properties on the brain. Just like you can lose control when a drug spikes your dopamine too much, you can lose control when a food spikes your dopamine too much. And that's really not that hard to achieve in the modern world, where we're surrounded by foods that spike dopamine to a historically unprecedented degree.
Right. And so I've also heard you talk a little bit about how the brain doesn't necessarily sense things like vitamins, minerals, magnesium, and things like that. So vegetables inherently just aren't that appealing, like you mentioned, the cucumber and lentils. So can folks maybe use that to their advantage and throw maybe some butter or some salt on some vegetables to make it easier to palate those foods?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this is a great point. Some people have this like intuitive idea that in the U.S. and other affluent countries, we overeat because our food doesn't contain enough micronutrients. So we're eating to try to get all the nutrients that aren't in our refined diet. But in fact, if that were the case, then everybody would just be downing kale. I mean, we have opportunities to get these micronutrients. People would just be like, they would react to kale, and they would react to spinach, and they would react to Brussels sprouts in the same way that they react to ice cream or brownies or these other things. But that's not the case. And especially kids, don't, the spinach and the kale and the Brussels sprouts, those are things you have to learn to like by virtue of repeated association with fat and starch, or fat and salt usually, but also sometimes starch and sugar and other things. So you have to learn to like those, and then finally, once you're an adult, you're like, oh yeah, I like kale. But as a kid, it's horrible. Like you don't want to eat kale, right? And I mean, that shows that all those micronutrients, even at very high levels, are not intrinsically motivating to the human brain. Those are things that have to be learned by virtue of their association with the fat and salt and stuff. So, and so yes, to answer your second question, I think that is a strategy for getting kids or anyone else to eat, not only to eat kale or spinach, but to actually learn to enjoy them over time. You repeatedly associate them with fat or salt or whatever other rewarding nutrient. And actually, I have an anecdote. And in fact, by the way, this type of reinforcement process has been already shown in research to operate in humans and specifically in children. And children are especially sensitive to these reinforcing effects. So it wasn't specifically using kale or spinach, but they showed that either fat or starch were both able to cause children to form a preference for previously neutral flavors that were paired with those nutrients. So we know this type of flavor nutrient learning, flavor nutrient reinforcement occurs in humans as well as animals. So presumably it would work also for spinach, kale, etc. So yeah, I have a friend who we had talked about this reward stuff, and he thought it was pretty interesting. And we had the exact same conversation you and I are having right now about, can you use this to get your kids to eat vegetables?
Exactly, yeah.
And so he did it. He did it with his kids. And so he would put liberal amounts of butter on these vegetables that he was growing in his backyard. So they would eat huge amounts of kale and broccoli and stuff. And it worked so well that not only do his kids like kale, they like it so much that they will go out into the backyard and grab handfuls of it out of his garden and eat it raw.
Oh, so they'll eat it raw. Wow.
Without anything on it. So, yeah, because once you form that association, once you learn to like kale or whatever it is after repeated association with fat and salt, that's a process of learning to like the actual texture and flavor of the kale itself. And so at that point, you might enjoy it. I mean, I wouldn't enjoy eating raw kale, but you probably would enjoy it more than you did before you had it repeatedly paired with some salt and fat. Same way that people, will drink black coffee. Some people will enjoy black coffee, whereas when they first tasted it, probably tasted horrible. So, they just go into their backyard and grab handfuls of kale and stuff it down. I've never seen a child do that in my entire life.
That's incredible.
Yeah. So I think the strategy does work. But I mean, I think it works at the risk of getting them accustomed to having tons of added fats on their food. So I don't know.
Oh, interesting.
Where the balance lies. Like, does that mean that as they grow up and become adults, the food's not going to taste right unless it has tons of butter on it? That might not be the best thing for an adult.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So that kind of leads us into our next point of palate fatigue and sensory-specific satiety. So how I heard you on an interview on the Rob Wolf podcast, and you guys were talking about this guy, Man versus Food, Adam Rickman, with the ice cream sundae, and he was able to actually eat more of that ice cream, finish the challenge because he broke it up with some salty, crunchy French fries. So can you tell us a little bit about that concept?
Yeah, I mean, that's really amazing and counterintuitive, I think. And I think that that is a compelling anecdote that illustrates a principle that has a lot of support from the research literature. And that is this concept of sensory-specific satiety, which is that you can become satiated on food. Satiated, in other words, you're full, you don't want to eat anymore, on a food with a specific flavor profile. But that doesn't mean that you're going to be fully satiated if you're offered some other type of food. And so the upshot of this is that the greater the variety of foods that you have in a meal, the more total calories you're likely to eat. It actually can be quite a large effect if you compare someone eating only one food to someone eating like 6 different foods or even more at a buffet, for example. You can get very large increases in food intake relative to that person only having access to one food. I mean, if you have one food, let's say it's complete. It's got, let's say it's like a stew or something. It's got your vegetables, it's got your starch, it's got your protein, it's got everything you need nutritionally. And you can eat that until you're full and you can feel satisfied on that. But then if dessert rolls around and there's a piece of cake or even other savory items like some, barbecued chicken or watermelon or whatever it is, you'll eat again. It's like your satiety goes away. Your satiety only applied to that one food, or at least only fully applied to that one food. So, and again, the most obvious example of this type of behavior in everyday life is what happens when we eat at buffets. I think most people will readily acknowledge that they overeat at buffets, including myself, and that lack of sensory-specific satiety, because every mouthful could be a different food, is part of that explanation. And I mean, it's really extraordinary to think about, like, especially in the case of the guy you were talking about, Alan Rickman, is that his name?
Adam Rickman, yeah, I think so.
Adam Rickman. Yeah, because, I mean, here he is eating an extraordinary amount of food, an extraordinary number of calories, right? Like a number of calories that's way more than you would want to do for your health. And yet eating even more calories, adding even more calories in fries allows him to eat even more ice cream. So it's like, it's a pretty counterintuitive effect, but it can have quite a large impact on calorie intake.
Yeah, it's just wild to think about eating more food can actually make you eat more food. It's incredible.
Yeah, it's counterintuitive for sure.
Yeah, so referencing back to those hunter-gatherers that can eat 20, 30 oranges in a sitting, guzzle a liter of honey, and from my understanding, the fattier the meat, the more that they can eat of it, actually. And how are those hunter-gatherers overriding these systems? Are they eating very quickly? It's a very different setup, but how is that happening?
Yeah, I think that our satiety systems are fairly flexible, because if you think about how an animal should be wired to survive in the wild, you wouldn't really want a satiety system that always makes you stop eating at the same level of calorie intake under every circumstances. That's not really what you'd be going for. What you would want is a satiety system that responds to prevailing conditions, including the current state of the body and the current state of the environment. So, for example, if you had an animal that was hungry, let's say it had a low energy status of its body currently, it's energy depleted, it's hungry, you would want to have a system that allows it to eat more calories at that time to make up for the energy shortfall. And likewise, if an animal encounters a food that's particularly valuable, something that's going to increase its reproductive success more than the foods it's typically encountering in its day-to-day life, you would want a system that can kind of take the brakes off and allow that animal to eat more of that food to take advantage of that particularly valuable situation. And so if you think about the context in the real world, you don't want to have these inflexible satiety systems. You want to have flexible satiety systems that can respond to these very important incentives. And so if you're a hunter-gatherer, hunter-gatherers tend to be fairly well-nourished compared to most everybody, but including like agricultural populations. And most groups are not facing like serious, severe starvation, but still often hunter-gatherers are not getting quite as many calories as they want. So if you actually speak with hunter-gatherers, this is what the anthropologist said who I spoke with, they usually want more food than they're getting. They're usually a little bit hungry. I'm not talking about starvation. I mean, you can look at their bodies. They look good. They have adequate amounts of muscle and fat. It's not like they're starving, but they want more food. They're a little bit hungry. Sometimes they're a lot hungry. And the amount of food in their environment is variable. So being able to take advantage of the situation where you have these easy windfalls of really calorie-dense food is something that is good for a hunter-gatherer. That's, gluttony is something that we view as a negative thing today, and it is negative. It hurts our health. It hurts many of our important goals in our life for our health, for our appearance, our physical performance. But in a hunter-gatherer setting, it's good for them. I mean,
it's healthful, right?
It's healthful. Yeah, it helps them get the energy they need to do everything they need to do in their lives, to run their immune system, to maintain fat and muscle levels, to fight off predators, to fight off the neighboring tribe, to build babies, to breastfeed, to be able to supply those children with enough food. Those things all impact reproductive success and are selected by natural selection. So So anyway, so it's good for them to take advantage of these windfalls. And I think we still have that wiring in our brains today, because it's only in the last, like, not even 100 years in affluent countries that food is not really an issue anymore for the vast majority of people. I should say getting enough calories is not really an issue for the vast majority of people in affluent nations today. But that's very recent. That's not wired into our brains. What's wired into our brains is that we might not be getting enough food, so we need to take advantage of these situations where we can get easy calories. And also, and again, it depends on the value of the food. So foods that are really delicious, that are highly palatable, or that we crave, those are foods, those are signs that the brain implicitly values those foods, implicitly places a very high value on those foods, because it's driving impulses and sensations that tend to cause you to seek and consume those foods. So the brain implicitly values those foods. It considers brownies and pizza, etc., on a instinctive, impulsive, implicit level. It considers those to be amazing foods. And that's why you feel the way you do in terms of the pleasure and the drive to eat them. And I mean, cognitively that they're not good for you, but that's not how your non-conscious brain systems are wired. Your non-conscious brain systems are wired for a different era where those calories are really important. And the salt's important, the sugar, everything about it is saying to your brain, this is an awesome food. This is something that's really going to help you out, really valuable for your survival and reproduction. Of course, it's the opposite today, but that's how our brains are wired. And so when your brain encounters a food that's really, really valuable, when it thinks it's really, really valuable, it starts doing things to remove barriers to consuming that food. And so it cuts back on your satiety responses. So the more delicious a food is, the more we can eat of it without feeling as full. And that motivational drive that we feel, not only does it motivate us to get the food, motivate us to start eating it, cut back on our satiety so we can eat more of it, it actually helps us overrule our satiety as well, the satiety that we may experience. So, I mean, at the end of a meal, when you've eaten savory foods, most of the time when I go to the restaurant, at the end of a meal, I'm not hungry anymore. You know, I have no hunger left, but I could still eat some cake, right?
Right.
So that's the typical response. When a food is really delicious at the end of the meal, and also the sensory-specific satiety thing plays in here too, but when a food's really delicious, we can go past that point of satiety that normally would tell us to stop eating. So there are all these things the brain does to sweep away barriers to consuming a food that it perceives as highly valuable. So all those things come together, all that wiring comes together to push us rather strongly to overconsume food in the context of modern foods and the modern food environment.
Right. And so knowing all of that information and how those highly rewarding foods can make us overeat, how about sort of the opposite end of that spectrum with something like Tim Steele's potato hack? I'm not crazy about that term hack, but I mean, it's incredible how you're just not using those systems, or basically using those systems to your advantage. So can you tell us a little bit about the potato hack?
Yeah, absolutely. Is this something you've tried?
It's not something that I've tried, but I mean, eating a plain potato is just completely different than eating one with chives, sour cream, bacon bits, and all that sort of stuff. And I think the appeal, another classic example is, you know, eating sushi without soy sauce. It's just so much more rewarding with some salt added to it. So it's not something that I've tried personally, but yeah, I'm fascinated by the concept.
Yeah, so I mean, I'm familiar with potato-only diets, but I'm not familiar with Steele's version. Is it just eating nothing but potatoes?
It's nothing but potatoes, and basically you just can't put anything on it. So,
yeah.
And also he talks about cooling the potatoes, building up some resistant starch in the potato, and then reheating it. And funny enough, each time that you cool it and reheat it, it actually builds up more resistant starch, which is quite odd. But either way, an amazing way to maybe just short term for somebody if they wanted to go to that extreme to lose weight.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, there's a fair amount of evidence that very bland and repetitive diets promote fat loss in people who carry excess fat, and the effect can actually be quite dramatic. There are some papers published that I discuss in more detail in my book where they put people who were quite obese on these bland liquid diets, and it's really interesting actually. When they put people who were lean on these bland liquid diets, their calorie intake was maintained, what was basically normal for weight maintenance for them. But when they put people with obesity on these diets, their calorie intake plummeted and they lost weight quite rapidly. And I think essentially when you take that reward aspect out of the diet almost completely, you're removing one of the main reasons that people eat, and particularly one of the main reasons why they eat more than they need to remain lean. And so, yeah, I mean, potato is, there are several things that converge to make the potato diet particularly effective for weight loss. One of them is that the potato has a very high satiety value per calorie. So per calorie, it makes you feel more full than almost anything else. Second, it's nutritionally complete, or I shouldn't say complete, but it's pretty close to complete. It's about the best you can do for a single food. It is missing a couple things like vitamin A and B12, but those are things that your liver stores that you can actually go quite a while without. So you can eat a potato-only diet for quite a while without encountering any nutritional problems. It contains complete protein. And it has a very low reward value. So that's the third thing. So it gets rid of all these cues in our daily lives that stimulate us to eat more because we find the food delicious and our brain implicitly thinks it's really valuable. Our brain's kind of meh on potatoes, right. On plain potatoes anyway. And, French fries, that's a different matter. And then the last thing is a lack of sensory-specific satiety. I mean, even if you ate a fairly delicious food as your only food for a long time, I think you would probably eat less of it than you do of your normal diet because the sensory-specific satiety kicks in and you're just not that excited about eating the same thing over and over and over again. So in that situation, in the potato diet situation, you're basically giving the brain the calories, you're giving your body the calories and nutrients it needs, but you're not giving the brain any of those signals that normally would drive us to overconsume. So your calorie intake just drops, your hunger drops. This is what most people report, and you start losing fat.
Yeah, so I mean, maybe a short-term solution for people. I personally wouldn't push the diet necessarily on anybody, but it could be an option for people in extreme circumstances. I know with my one-on-one clients, when they're having a tough time with satiety, sometimes I'll just ask them to switch all of their carbohydrate sources, starchy carbs, over to potato, just because it's that much more filling. So it can.
Do you see good results with that?
Yeah, it seems to work quite well.
Nice.
It's pretty cool. So I'd love to get your thoughts on sort of the demonization of sugar nowadays. We used to be fat, now it's sugar, and how maybe it's not quite that simple that sugar in itself is fattening and sugar in itself is evil, but in a broader context, where does sugar lie in our diets, and sort of what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah. So, I mean, we're in the midst of a sort of sugar mania that has been triggered primarily by some major persuaders, including Robert Lustig and Gary Taubes. And I think if you were an alien who came down to Earth with no preconceived notions, and you just started browsing through the scientific literature to try to evaluate this hypothesis that sugar is the primary cause of human obesity, I think you would pretty quickly conclude that it's not. The literature, I think, overall is pretty convincing that sugar is probably a contributor to obesity. It probably does contribute, but it's not the sole contributor. I mean, that's just flies in the face of so much research. So this sugar mania that we have, it's a reflection of the fact that we like clean, simple stories. So, we like to be able to point our finger at one thing that's easy to understand and that's easy to act on. So you can act on that by removing all sugar from your diet, and you probably will lose weight, in part because you'll be removing almost all processed food and a lot of the calorie-dense, high-fat foods in your diet as well, like cookies and brownies and all that good stuff, chocolate. And so I think the bigger picture is that the brain is not just seeking sugar. The brain is also seeking fat. The brain is also seeking protein. Also alcohol is one I didn't mention, but that's another energy-containing macronutrient. And these things all contribute to your calorie intake. They all contribute to your motivation to eat excess calories. And it doesn't really matter where those calories are coming from. If you're taking in excess calories, you're going to gain fat. I mean, we have good evidence at this point, very convincing evidence that in terms of your body fat level, it doesn't matter where those calories come from. When you put people in a metabolic ward and you precisely control their calorie intake, messing with macronutrients has no effect on their body fatness whatsoever. And if you change, so if you change macronutrients independently of calorie intake, it has no effect. If you change calorie intake independently of macronutrients, it does have an effect. So as far as we currently know, calories matter, macronutrients don't. So it all just boils down to how many calories we're eating and what are the properties of food that are stimulating us to eat too many calories. And it's abundantly clear that both sugar and fat can do that, as well as salt and MSG and some other things. And when I say MSG, I really mean glutamate, which comes from many places, not just MSG. It's in soy sauce, it's in bone broth, it's in cooked meat. And so, and I mean, this idea that sugar has metabolic effects that tell our fat cells to suck up fat and that makes us fat, it's just nonsense. I mean, if you look in animal models, sugar is not very fattening. Sugar is just not that fattening in animal models by itself. If you mix it, it can exacerbate the fattening effects of a calorie-dense, higher fat diet if you mix it in with fat. But on its own, I mean, you can feed animals diets that are 60% sugar, 60% fructose. And in most studies, they don't even gain weight at all. They might gain a little bit of weight in some studies, but they don't gain nearly as much weight as when you feed them diets that are very calorie dense and high in fat. And especially the thing that makes them gain the most is if you feed them human junk food. So these are things that are highly palatable combinations of all those reward factors we were talking about earlier. That they'll eat more than any macronutrient could possibly get them to eat. So the sugar story, and I want to remind people that rodents have insulin, they have fat cells, they have everything that is supposed to be the mechanism by which sugar makes us fat, and yet it doesn't make them fat. So that simple story is simply not correct. It doesn't make any sense. And the story is more complicated in humans, of course, but I think the evidence overall points to sugar being a factor, but it's not the factor. And I think we need to get around this tendency of ours to want to point our finger at one single thing and blame the entire world on it, because the fact is that sugar intake has decreased by like 20% in the United States since the turn of the last century, and our obesity rate and our diabetes rate just keep going up and up and up. It's not just about sugar, and the more we focus exclusively on sugar, the more we're going to miss out on the real story, and the less effective our efforts are going to be.
Yeah, I think a lot of people would be surprised to hear that stat because, you know, the way sugar is demonized, they just assume that our sugar intake must just be at an all-time high. And it's not like people are walking around the streets with bags of sugar and spooning plain table sugar into their mouths. It's the combination of these foods that make these highly rewarding combos that are very appealing to the brain, right? So we have evidence of hunter-gatherer communities thriving off all sorts of different macronutrient ratios, and like you said, the calories are king, right? So we can fluctuate with our macronutrient intake and still maintain a healthy body composition, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So if you control your calories precisely, as far as we know from the best available evidence, macronutrients have no impact on your body fatness. However, that doesn't necessarily mean that macronutrients in an unconstrained setting where calories are not controlled don't impact your body fatness, because the type of food that you eat can affect how many calories you eat. So even though macronutrients act, even though everything is passing through this mechanism of calories in the causal chain from food to obesity, the type of food can impact and can still impact body fatness by impacting the number of calories we eat. So for example, protein is more satiating per calorie than either fat or carbohydrate. And so if your diet contains a higher proportion of protein, you will probably eat fewer calories and you will probably have a lower level of body fatness over time. Conversely, if you're tending to eat very high fat foods, especially in a setting where you're adding fats, so very concentrated fats, and you're not restricting your carbohydrate intake, you're probably going to overeat calories. If you're like most people, you'll overeat calories and you'll gain fat. Now, you wouldn't gain fat if you were eating those exact same foods and not eating more calories, but because of the fact that those foods stimulate most people to eat more calories, they will still impact your body fatness indirectly.
Right, and so that kind of leads us into the next point perfectly around your analogy with the set point and the thermostat. So how can people moderate or make it easier for themselves to sort of stay at their set point, or when they lose weight, maintain their set point? How can people do that?
Yeah, so I think a really important concept to understand is that it's really all about how easy it is to create and maintain leanness, if that's your goal. Because the fact is that any person with obesity can lose weight to the level of a lean person by eating fewer calories. If they restrict their calories enough, they will lose that amount of weight. But if you're doing that, it's difficult. That's the problem. The problem is not that it's impossible. The problem is that it's very, very difficult. In fact, so difficult that ordinary mortals are probably not capable of it in most cases, because you end up fighting against these brain systems. And so the question is, how do you make it as easy as possible so that people can lose as much weight as possible and maintain it as easily as possible? And that's all about making it as easy as possible and aligning your conscious goals, your conscious rational goals of weight loss with the goals of your non-conscious brain systems that in the context of the modern world tend to drive you to eat too much food. And so just to make that a little bit more concrete, for example, if you're losing weight and you feel really, really hungry all the time, that's going to make it really difficult for you to maintain compliance with that level of calorie restriction, and you'll probably eventually not be able to maintain it. So how do you address that? Well, the big picture answer is you try to understand how these non-conscious brain systems work, which I do in my book, and you try to give them the cues they need to have them align with your goals and support your goals instead of fighting against your goals. So that way you're not fighting yourself anymore. You are cooperating with yourself to lose fat and maintain a leaner body. So one of the primary ways in which you end up fighting yourself if you try to lose weight is you end up fighting something in the brain called the lipostat. And this is a system of brain circuitry that's located primarily in a brain region called the hypothalamus, and it regulates your body fat level in a way that's kind of analogous to how your thermostat works. So in your house, your thermostat is always measuring the temperature using a thermometer inside it and comparing that to an internal standard, its set point that you program into it. That's the temperature you want it to defend. And so when the temperature starts to drop, that thermometer gets wind of it and measures that drop in temperature, and that kicks in a response by the thermostat, and that is to turn on the heat. And that brings the temperature back up to that set point that you programmed. So as it turns out, the human brain also regulates body temperature using thermometers in a very similar way. It uses thermometers in your skin and inside your body to measure your temperature and measure threats to your internal temperature via your skin. And it integrates all of that information. And if your temperature starts to drop, it generates a suite of behavioral and physiological responses that oppose temperature change. So if it starts to drop, you will, on the behavior side, you'll want to go somewhere warm. You'll want to put on a sweater. You might adopt a heat-conserving posture, like crossing your legs and arms. You might want a hot beverage. And then on the physiological side, you're going to get things like shivering. You're going to get constriction of blood vessels in your skin to conserve core body heat. You're going to get brown fat thermogenesis, which is burning fat for energy, for heat, I should say. And all of these things together do an insanely good job of maintaining your core body temperature within like a degree. So it's a highly effective system of preventing changes from a preferred place, preferred set point. And turns out that happens for body fatness too. But unlike your thermostat, your lipostat, which maintains your body fat level, really responds mostly to declines in body fat. Doesn't really protect you that well against increases in body fat. It's really there to prevent you from losing weight. And sounds like really horrible and unfair, but you have to consider it from the evolutionary context where for our ancestors, weight loss was a much more common occurrence and a much greater threat than weight gain. So in a hunter-gatherer context, obesity just does not exist. That was not something natural selection had to wire our brains to protect against. But weight loss and the consequences of it, that was a serious threat that required vigorous responses. And so we have these responses wired into our brains. Our hypothalamus is measuring our body fat level using this hormone called leptin that's produced in fat tissue in proportion to its size. So that's like the thermometer in your thermostat. Your brain's measuring leptin to gauge your fat tissue size. When you start losing weight and your fat size drops, your fat mass drops, that kicks in behavioral and physiological responses to oppose the fat loss and regain the fat. And so that's very similar to how those behavioral and physiological responses are engaged by temperature regulation systems. So, but the responses, of course, are different. So in this case, you get behaviors like you're going to have more cravings, you're going to have more hunger, your satiety at a meal is going to be inhibited. You're going to be more attuned to food cues. So you'll be driven to eat more food. At the same time, you're going to have physiological things happening, like the energy cost of physical activity will go down so that your body burns fewer calories for the same movement. Your basal metabolic rate may go down a little bit. You may feel more sluggish. You may feel cold. Your metabolic rate will slow, basically, if you lose enough weight, enough fat, I should say. And all those things together are going to make life difficult for you if you're trying to lose weight. And in fact, so difficult that most people are not able to maintain significant amounts of weight loss over a period of years using standard approaches. And so the question is there anything we can do about this? I mean, this is really, we're digging down here to the fundamental reason, or at least a fundamental reason why weight loss is so hard. You literally have systems in your brain that are pushing back against you, forcing you to fight against yourself. And the more you lose, the harder you have to fight. So we're really drilling down to the fundamental reasons why weight loss is so difficult. So what do we do about that? Is there a way to remove that very powerful barrier? And I think there are some ways. Some of them we have more direct evidence for than others, but there's evidence that you can change your set point, that the set point for body fat regulation is not inflexible. Like we talked about earlier in the interview, the brain has ways of modifying these systems depending on the context in which you're in. And so, for example, some things that are either known or strongly suspected to lower the set point, eating food that's less rewarding. So food that's blander, less delicious, simpler, eating food in a very simple, natural state like our ancestors would have eaten it, tends to lower the set point. Eating food that's higher in protein tends to lower the set point. And we know this because in studies, people will spontaneously eat fewer calories, even if their calories are not restricted, if they're eating a high protein diet. Also, their calorie expenditure will not, their metabolic rate will not decline as much if they're losing weight on a high protein diet. So we see all these signs that this process that fights back is being curtailed when people eat a high protein diet. And then there are some other things like regular physical activity seems to be able to lower the set point in many people, not everyone. And all of these things probably vary from person to person, but these are things that on average should help. Getting restorative sleep is another one, and managing stress effectively. Those are all things that potentially can impact the set point and bring the activity of these non-conscious brain circuits that are regulating your body fatness in line with your weight goals for yourself and create easier and more sustainable weight management for you.
Oh, that's an amazing explanation. I think a really good way for people to think about this is that, being hungry all the time is just not maintainable. It's a matter of when you're going to eat highly rewarding foods, not if. So someone can manage their set point a lot easier if they emphasize single minimal ingredient whole foods that aren't over the top rewarding. And it's just going to make it a lot easier to lose weight to begin with and then also maintain their weight.
Yeah, that's right. And I think everybody's balance is going to be a little bit different because, one thing I've learned about the simple food strategy is that some people are just like powerfully attached to the pleasure value and the reward value of their food, like to the point where eating simple foods is like this epic Herculean struggle for them. And I'm not like that, so it's hard for me to understand. But I think, your brain gets accustomed to the good stuff and it doesn't want to give it up, is what it boils down to. And so I think there's a balance to be struck. Some people will be able to eat very simple foods and it's not an issue for them. Other people will struggle with that. So I think basically finding the right balance where your overall strategy is as easy and comfortable as possible, that's going to be the best thing for you for weight management.
Right. And I think a lot of people notice that start to shift their food habits in that direction is that the palate, their tongue actually adjusts and they start to taste those foods a little bit more than they do. They taste really bland and boring at the beginning, but weeks and weeks of piling that together, they actually start to taste a little bit better. But man, it's not easy. It's not easy.
Yeah. And that actually relates to a well-established principle in psychology, which is literally called forgetting. So just as our conscious circuits forget, where the keys are or where we park the car and all that stuff, our non-conscious circuits forget those reward associations over time. So the longer you go without these highly rewarding, highly seductive foods, the less of a pull they have on your brain.
Right, and sort of tying it back into the beginning with your friend who fed their children buttery vegetables, I think that people can associate those single to minimal ingredient, simpler foods with feeling good. So they can create those positive associations that way as well. But by no means is it easy. So I think it'd be really helpful for people to see how you eat on a daily basis, knowing all of the things that you do. So what is sort of an average day, breakfast, lunch, dinner, if you eat breakfast or whatever? How does that look for you, Stephan?
Yeah. So I want to preface this by saying that I don't have any very major specific health goals at this time. I'm just trying to maintain general health and leanness. So I'm not trying to lose weight. I'm not trying to work with diabetes or anything like that. So that's the context of this. So for breakfast, I generally have, most typically I will have oatmeal with homemade whole milk yogurt and some kind of fruit, usually blueberries. So I keep bags of frozen berries in the freezer and I'll mix those in with the oatmeal and then eat with homemade whole milk yogurt. For lunch, it's usually a potato, just baked or microwaved, plain, and I'll eat that with whatever's around, leftovers, or often an egg. And then sometimes a piece of fruit, apple, most typically, especially this time of year. And then for dinner, I'm the chef in the house, and probably the most common thing I make is some kind of stew that's based either on meat or beans. So there'll be chicken or, most often some kind of chicken, with a lot of vegetables. So it'll be equal volume of meat and vegetables. And then there'll be a tomato base or something like that. Sometimes it'll be bone broth base, or it'll be beans and vegetables. And then I'll usually put some nuts or something in there too. And there's usually a couple of herbs. I'll put sage or rosemary, something in it. And then we eat that with some kind of plain starch. So it'll either be plain potatoes, baked or microwaved, or it'll be these sort of savory pancakes I make out of whole grains, or it'll be brown rice, sometimes white rice. But those are the most typical things we eat. So dinner, for me, dinner is having a complete meal at dinner means having some kind of protein, either meat or beans, or eggs. And also fish. We eat fish fairly often. So there's a protein, there's some kind of starch, which is usually some kind of plain starch like what I described, and then some kind of vegetable. So often that'll be in the stew itself, or it will be in the form of a salad or some kind of baked winter squash or something like that on the side.
Awesome. So you're actually eating your potatoes without butter, without salt and things like that. You eat them quite plain. And are they regular potatoes, or are you a yam guy, sweet potato?
I eat both, but I grow potatoes, and so I eat many more potatoes than I eat sweet potatoes. I like both. I can only eat so much sweet potatoes and yams. The sweetness of it gets a little much for me at meal after meal.
I think a lot of people would wish they were that same way. A yam was too sweet for them, or a sweet potato was too sweet.
Well, it's funny because I mean, some sweet things that are very sweet, I love. Like ice cream is like crack for me.
Oh, me too, man.
Brownies, cookies, all that stuff is amazing. But yeah, there's something about just like eating large quantities of it as part of the savory part of the meal that just doesn't. It's good in limited quantities, but meal after meal, it gets a little tiresome for me. Whereas a plain starch like potatoes, that's easier. And they grow really well around here. So we have our garage is full of potatoes, and I want to specify that although I'm not putting butter, sour cream, oil, and other calorie dense toppings on the potatoes, I do. I'll like put things on top of it. Like if there's a stew, I'll put that on top of it. So there's usually some kind of sauce or something associated with the meal that's going on the potato, but it's not usually something that's very calorie dense that I'm specifically adding onto the potato.
Right. So it's not just a dry potato. You're adding some sort of texture with that. Cool.
Yeah, usually. I mean, I find it kind of hard to eat just a regular dry potato with nothing on it, or it's okay if I have something to drink, but it just kind of gets stuck in my throat.
Well, I think that's what the potato diet is banking on, that they're just like, oh. Yeah. So just kind of wrapping things up, how have you adjusted your food environment, the more and more you've learned about this sort of stuff, to work for you? Because I know that it's sort of the lowest hanging fruit, right? Food environment. Again, it's a matter of when you're going to eat something that's hanging around, not if, because of that internal wiring. So how have you adjusted and modified your food environment?
Yeah, I think the food environment is huge. So it is something that I focus on in my daily life. So essentially, the first thing is that there's little or no visible food anywhere in my house, except things that would require some preparation. So like, there's like jars of raw grains and things, but I'm not going to stick my hand in and start chewing on those.
They're not peanut M&Ms hanging out on your counter.
Yeah, exactly. So I'm not giving my brain food cues that stimulate my desire to eat. And the things that are available, which sometimes are there, sometimes are not, will be like fruit, peanuts in shells or other nuts in shells, things that require a little bit of work to eat. And then, so those are things that are like out and visible. There's little or nothing. There are some things, if I really want to snack, I can shell some peanuts. We have a bunch of apples in the garage I can go grab, but those are not things that are readily available, that are really like under my nose and tempting me every time I walk by. They're things that require a little bit of effort, that I have to have some level of hunger or motivation to seek out. And then I just don't keep other really seductive things in my house at all. Like, I have this weird attraction for goldfish. My wife brought some back, and I can't stop eating those things. I don't know why, but I told her, you got to get rid of these, and she brought them into work because I can't have those in the house. There's no ice cream in our freezer. There's no cookies or cake in our fridge. I just don't even bring that stuff into the house, except occasionally. I'm not perfect, and I'm not trying to be perfect. But those are things that I don't have in my house very often because I know I will eat them, and I'll probably overeat them. So yeah, those are really the two main things. I guess three things is minimizing visible food in your environment. And for me, I work at home, so there's no food around in my workplace either. Minimizing visible food cues, creating small effort barriers, like having to peel an orange or shell nuts. So you have small effort barriers to eating, and then making it so that the most tempting things are not even in your house at all. So if you have to go to the store to get ice cream to eat it, not only are you less likely to actually do that and to actually eat ice cream, but in fact, you'll be less likely to even crave it because it's not even an option for your brain.
Right. So basically making it very inconvenient to eat convenience foods. So I love that tip too, with buying shelled peanuts as opposed to, something that would be much more palatable, like salted and roasted. It's just
yeah. I should specify they're in-shell, unsalted peanuts.
Right. Yeah. So that helps a ton, and it's just setting yourself up for success. I love that. So what sort of research currently or topics are exciting you at the moment? What's sort of next for you? I know you released your book, but what's next? What's getting you up in the morning?
Well, the primary thing that I'm doing right now is science consulting for an organization called GiveWell, and I do research reviews for them. They rank charities on the basis of cost effectiveness, and they publish these recommendations, and those end up directing tens of millions of dollars to these charities. So, really cool organization that I'm happy to be working with. But I do research reviews for them in different areas of interest. So I'm probing around in the research literature and trying to figure out whether these generally health and or nutrition and or infectious disease interventions are effective at improving human well-being. One of the things I've been working on lately that is really interesting is worm parasites, also known as helminths. And these are things like hookworm and whipworm and ascaris and schistosomiasis. And these things can have some definite negative effects under certain circumstances. But it turns out that they might actually have benefits too. And this is all part of the hygiene hypothesis, which is the idea that we used to have exposure to all sorts of things in our former less hygienic state, and that although obviously there are drawbacks to that there were also some benefits, and we're losing those benefits today. And so it turns out that these intestinal worms, they very powerfully modulate the immune system to induce tolerance so that your immune system doesn't reject them. And because of that, they seem to, at least in animal models, have very powerful protective effects against allergies, against inflammatory disease, and against autoimmune disease, and also possibly metabolic disease and cardiovascular disease as well, although I haven't gone as deep into the literature on that. But I'm talking about really powerful effects like prevention of type 1 diabetes, prevention of rheumatoid arthritis, reversal or prevention of allergies, reversal or prevention of inflammatory bowel diseases like Crohn's and ulcerative colitis. So, the human evidence, they've started doing randomized controlled trials where they literally infect people with some of these worms. It's pretty crazy. And wow. The human evidence is a lot more mixed than the animal evidence, so it's not like a home run. But I think it's a really interesting hypothesis, and there's probably something to it.
Wow, that's fascinating how those worms can potentially modulate the immune response. I mean, especially for autoimmune disease that's just climbing like crazy. That's wild. So, as far as a place where you implement this information with your business partner, Dan Party, who we mentioned before, can you tell us just a little bit about the Ideal Weight program that you set up?
Yeah, absolutely. So the Ideal Weight program is a weight management system that Dan and I developed to try to implement the best ideas and the best practices that weight management science has to offer. So one of the things that I notice about a lot of weight loss or weight management programs is they tend to have one thing that they focus on that's like their explanation for obesity and their solution to it. And that's not true for every program, but that is true for a lot of very prominent programs. And it's, it's not that those programs don't have any efficacy, but I think that the true cause and solution to excess body fatness is simply more complex than that. And so we tried to, we created a program that tries to encompass the primary drivers of excess body fatness and the primary ways in which you can reverse that into our program, and while still trying to keep it as streamlined as possible. And so it's a course-based program. The new version is course-based. We're really excited about that. It's really slick, really professional. And during the courses, there are these little quizzes to keep you engaged and make sure that you're retaining the material. And it also has a component of tracking. So you get daily feedback on key behaviors like physical activity, body weight, and sleep. And you also, another thing we just added is a questionnaire, a weight insight questionnaire. So it asks you a bunch of questions about different aspects of your weight-related behaviors, and it scores your current performance in each of 6 key categories that determine body weight. And these 6 key categories dovetail with the ones in the last chapter of my book, and they also dovetail with the categories that we focus on in the Ideal Weight Program. So the idea is to say, like, how well are you doing in these categories? Where are your best opportunities for improvement? And then the Ideal Weight Program provides the means to start working on those opportunities.
That's awesome. Dan sent me access to the program, and I had to look through it. It looks amazing. It's really cool, and I really like the quiz aspect too. So, Stephan, where can folks find a little bit more out about you if they're interested? Where can they purchase your book? Can they follow you on social media? All that good stuff.
Yeah, so my website is at stephanguyenet.com. It's StephanGuyenet. If that's too complicated to spell, you can also get there via wholehealthsource.org. So I have a page for the book as well, or you can just look it up on Amazon, The Hungry Brain. And I'm also fairly active on Twitter, although less so lately. I'm trying to wean myself off of it. I'll continue.
It's a dark hole you can just go into.
Yeah, exactly. It's the pull is too strong for me. I'll continue to communicate on it, but I'm not going to read it as much or engage as much with comments and things. But I still do post studies a lot, post thoughts. I post whenever I put posts on my blog, I will post it on Twitter. So, and my handle is at WHSource.
Awesome, Stephan. So I'm going to link to all that stuff in the show notes for you guys. So if you're interested in following up with the work, the book, social media, all that good stuff, I'm going to link to it all in the show notes and make it easy to access. So I just want to thank you so much for coming on the show. I know that listeners are going to benefit so much for that information, and we laid a really cool, clear groundwork on, just why we get fat in the first place, and sort of a lot of these concepts take guilt out of the equation, and it's like, this is internal wiring that has gotten us to this point, and now there's a little bit of an evolutionary mismatch, and so we gave you guys some tips on how to manage that stuff. So thanks again, and hopefully have you back sometime in the future.
All right, thanks, Marcus.